So I'd say that it's right for the DOJ. And if I had to bet, I can't imagine the DOJ going this far and then stopping based on this
Pulling
settlement
back.
that yeah, that could yeah, because now, the DOJ has been involved with NAR before. They've been involved with litigation. They've been involved with consent decrees. They've been involved and the bottom line is nothing changed.
All right, folks, we are back and we have a returning guest on the show this week for the three-peat, the third time on our show, talking about kind of the same subject, which just, leads you to believe he's really good at this. He knows what he's talking about when we're talking about the NAR settlement. I have the great Saul Klein here with us, only has a few decades of experience, in this whole MLS policy, information sharing, industry. He's been a great source of information, for my audience, for a lot of audiences in the industry in the US. He leads the San Diego MLS, one of my favorite MLSs. I'm that's the area where I grew up in, right across the border. So I know that market really, really well. It's a great market, very large MLS too. I think it's always interesting. We have such a large group of agents. And Saul has really been a thought leader, when it comes to MLSs in general, but specifically the NAR settlement and how it affects, the whole MLS system, the whole Realtor system. And he's been given some great takes the last few months, and particularly the last month or two. Saul has been really talking about, how to prepare for this NAR settlement, what things people are doing good, and what things people can do better at. And where there's a lot of misunderstandings, right, around the NAR settlement. Because I was telling Saul right before the call, the rubber's hitting the road now. Now it's go time. We're no longer in the I think this might happen, I think that might happen. Now real estate agents everywhere have to go and execute on these new rules with the best understanding they have, given by their broker, by their trainer, by their team leader, by some random social media post, perhaps. They're going to grab the information they have at hand and they're going to do their best to be compliant and try to be successful in this new world. And today I'd love to talk to Saul about what are people getting wrong, Saul? Where are some of the myths around this NAR settlement? Maybe people are doing some things right. I'd love to hear your take on that. But I'd love to focus and hone into where do you think we can do better as the deadline is practically here? Go for it, Saul.
Gus, good to see you. Good to be back talking about one of my favorite subjects. And, you asked a very broad question. You probably asked 100 questions in that one question.
For
And,
sure.
right. And so I'll kind of do my best and we can just kind of get into conversation about it. I think that you're right. The rubber meets the road August 17th. That's the deadline given by NAR to MLS's brokerage firm, anybody that is included in this settlement to proceed with paragraph 58. That's an important one. Paragraph 58, which are practice changes. Because the settlement itself is about 108 pages long. The most important one for most people is the paragraph on practice changes. That is paragraph 58, and there's like 13 practice changes. And so I think that what people need to do to first begin to understand it, read the entire 108 pages. But absent that, read paragraph 58. And there are some things we know for sure, and there are some things that we're not quite sure. And that has to do with the nature of the settlement itself, the parties who were at the table, the intentions of the parties, which we're not privy to. And so when you look at the settlement, unfortunately, it's actually a proposed settlement still. The final settlement date's like November 26th. That's interesting. Everybody's getting this confused with the Department of Justice. And of course, the Department of Justice is not a party to this. And so, but they probably will weigh in. That's what people are expecting. And sometime maybe in October, if we're lucky. So we've got August 17th. And so what people need to do to get this right is to first understand that there still is ambiguity. One of the reasons there's ambiguity is we don't have a definitions section to where when we say a certain word, we're all in agreement as to what that word means. And that's kind of a problem. But first, let's understand that what we're talking about is a proposed civil settlement, civil litigation. It's the Sitzer-Burnett case, which is Missouri, spreads up into Illinois, Merrill, got pieces around the country. It's a civil settlement where the National Association of Realtors and then MLSs and brokerage firms have agreed to the terms of this proposed settlement. And the one thing we know for sure is that on August 17th, at most MLSs across the country, the offer of compensation will no longer be part of the MLS. And so know that MLS, part of the definition of MLS, which means the definitions have to change, the bylaws have to change, the rules have to change for MLS, that the MLS was an offer of compensation. It will no longer be an offer of compensation. That being the case, there will be no compensation field. There'll be no word around compensation. And so where before we knew if we represented buyers in real estate transactions, we knew what we were going to be, how we were going to be rewarded by going to the MLS. We don't know that. We won't know that on August 17th. Actually, at our MLS in San Diego, I haven't made the final decision yet. My board of directors will make that on August 1st, but we're looking at August 12th because it's more than just eliminating one field. It's eliminating wherever compensation appears. It's also changing input forms. A number of things have to take place, and we have to be the biggest thing for us as an MLS, and I think for real estate practitioners as well, is compliance, making sure you comply with this. So the offer of compensation no longer part of the MLS, and that means the automatic, all I got to do is bring in a buyer, get the offer signed, drag the buyer to the closing, and I'm going to get paid even if it's my first day in real estate. Those days are gone. And so now if you represent also a practice change, you're going to have to get a contract with the buyer that allows for the readily ascertainable amount of compensation to the buyer broker. And that has to take place before you tour a property, before you show a property. So yes, we've got forms changing across the country. We've got classes that are being given. The National Association of Realtors offered free ABR classes. And I would say get all the education you can. And even then, you're not going to be ready for this. So just accept it. It's going to be a different way to do business. How will I know what the compensation is? Will the seller be willing to pay the compensation? How about concessions? What's the difference in concessions and compensation? And can we state concessions? Lots of questions. But how do we know if anything is being offered by the seller? I heard something this morning. Somebody said, well, in the remarks section, add call listing agent for showing instructions. Call listing agent for showing instructions. And so if you have that in the remarks section and an agent wants to know if anything's being offered to the buyer's agent, they can call and ask. Now, the intention of the settlement is that if you represent a buyer, remember you're going to have a contract to do that, that you ask for the compensation. If you want the seller to pay, you ask for it in the contract and in the offer to purchase. And the dilemma is, what if the seller says no? Well, you have to be ready. What this does is this then really starts to commingle the valuation of the property, the selling price, with the commission. And so an offer could come in, because it's all about seller net, typically, isn't it? What is a seller net? Yes. And so if somebody offers $500,000 on a property and requests that, let's just say, $20,000 also be paid to the buyer's rep, that would net $480 for the seller. Somebody could also come in with an offer offering $490 with no asking for no compensation or no consideration or no concession to the buyer's rep, in which case they net $490. And so that offer is a better offer, even though the price is lower. And so it's going to make people start to think about this. It's going to bring the commission and the selling price into one view, whereas before, again, with the MLS, it didn't matter how much experience you had. The MLS was an offer of compensation, and you knew you'd get paid whether you had any experience or not, whether it took 1 day or 5, it didn't matter. You got paid, and this was one of the fears, actually one of the points of the plaintiffs and the DOJ, and that is the MLS facilitated artificial commissions, artificially high commissions, because of something called steering, which was where some people believed that if the MLS had a lower offer of compensation to somebody representing a buyer, the property wouldn't be shown as frequently. And that, in essence, forced sellers to offer more. That threat of whether or not steering took place, and some would argue whether it did or does or doesn't, right? The fact is that the fear of steering, according to the DOJ and to the plaintiff's attorneys, the fear of steering keeps commissions artificially high. And so any pre-knowledge of commissions is not desirable from the plaintiff's position and from the DOJ's position. So I want to take just a moment to kind of go through the C words, because I think the C words are important, right? And so the C words are, first, compensation. What do we mean? And it's important that we know what each other's means when we're talking about things, right?
Words matter.
Words matter. Words matter. So compensation is typically, and it can be whatever we want, but if we agreed on a language, it would make it much easier to have discussions, right? So compensation is typically the broker to broker. That's compensation. And the DOJ doesn't like that, because what that does is it creates this reliance where competitors rely upon one another for compensation. And that's, in the eyes of the DOJ and the trust busters of the DOJ, they're not crazy about this idea of competitors working so closely together and relying upon one another. So compensation is typically broker to broker, right? Because only the broker can earn commission. We know it filters down to the agents and how license law works, but it's broker. So compensation, broker to broker. Concession. Concessions, and the lending institutions have something to do with this. Concession is typically something that the seller is willing to give to the buyer. That's a concession. That's seller to buyer or buyer to seller, a concession. And I want to come back and talk about these things a little bit.
Yeah.
Then another C word is commission. Commission is just a way to get paid. It's a way to get paid, typically a percentage of the price of something. And compensation or concession, both of those could be in the form of a, somehow in a commission structure. So commission is like a payment. And then another C word that's not used frequently, but I think is an important word, is consideration, which is one of the essential elements of a contract. Remember the 4 essential elements of a contract? We used to remember it by the words Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola. You need consent, CO, consent. You need to have capacity. There needs to be lawful object, and, right, consent, capacity, lawful object, and consideration, anything of value. So when we're talking about money being paid, in the real estate industry, kind of there are these different ways to relate to it: compensation, concession, commission, consideration. And it's just important that when we're having conversations with one another, we know what we're referring to. And so you've got this, you've had this field in the MLS for years. It's compensation. It's where one broker would pay another broker commission for the broker who represents the buyer to bring in the buyer. Typically, the seller paid the listing broker, and the listing broker would then share that commission, by compensating the buyer broker. Now, that wasn't always the case. Prior to the mid-90s, early 90s, the MLS was an offer of subagency. And in those days, everybody represented the seller. So now we've got no more offer of compensation. That means the MLS is not an offer of compensation. We've got to change our bylaws, change our rules. And so now if I want to know what I get paid, I can't go into the MLS and look it up. I need to have a contract with the buyer. And in that contract, I have to say to the buyer, okay, I'm going to work with you, and we're going to, in the offer, we're going to ask the seller to pay me. And we might even say, and if the seller doesn't, you, the buyer, have to. And that's a whole nother bag of worms. And right. And will they, or will the seller want to pay? Well, you know what? If you explain,
can they is another interesting question. Do they have the funds to do it? Yeah, it's a can of worms.
It's a can of worms. Well, and so will the seller pay the buyer's representative? Well, I think if you explain, if you're the listing agent and you explain to the seller the value that a buyer broker brings to the transaction in helping that buyer qualify, in finding the buyer, helping the buyer qualify, walking the buyer through the loan process, helping the buyer fill out the form. I mean, there's like a gazillion things that the agent for the buyer actually does that benefit the seller. And so it's important that the agent representing the seller, the listing agent, explain that when offers come in, there'll probably be requests that the seller compensate the buyer's agent, and it's not as bad as you think, seller. You're going to gain a lot of benefit. And oh, by the way the industry's worked for years is the seller always paid this. And so we're not changing this in any way, but we never had to explain the value before. And boy, understand the value that a buyer broker really brings. And if nothing else, maybe relieving the seller of some liability.
Yeah.
Right. Because at least they're professionally represented. They've got their own agent. So there's a case to be made that the seller should pay because the buyer's making the transaction work. They're bringing the funds to the table. They're funding the transaction. They might not have enough cash to pay their agent, but they do have the wherewithal to bring the loan to the table. And so the seller wanting to sell their property should be willing to look at this openly and look at the bottom line and look at what they net. Now, a word about concessions, because some people say, well, we're just going to add a concession field to the MLS.
So, and I wanted to ask you about that, Saul, because I've seen a little bit of a tendency to people just say, why don't we just making that suggestion, saying, why don't we just add a concessions field in the MLS and just state the percentage the concession is, and then we're going to be fine. And that seems a little bit, I'd love to get your take, because that seems a little bit like we're trying to make the new world a lot like the old world. And it just seems like that's just not going to fly. That would be my interpretation. And there's a lot of, flame wars online about this or not. That just seems too close to comfort to just magically having your field in the MLS stating a seller concession. What do you think about that?
Well, so this is a controversial subject, and I recognize that. And thoughtful people have different ideas about this. But for me, it's like, and I'll go into a couple examples. Remember what the DOJ's intention is, and then look at the settlement and know that the DOJ might get involved. And the idea is to break this threat of steering and to break the reliance, right? Break this reliance on these brokers that are involved. And so we're going to remove compensation from the MLS. If we add the word concession, how many people will think that's nothing more than a new way to express compensation? Now, I also want to add, as realtors, we are trained from the day we get in the business to avoid anything that has to do with antitrust, aren't we? Oh, don't say
100%.
Never
Don't
mention
even talk about it. Don't even mention a
why?
number. I was, my broker was scared. Don't even. I go, well, that's not price fixing. It doesn't matter. Don't even say the number. It doesn't exist, right? Yes, 100%.
We go overboard. In my mind, I used to think, well, if you don't talk about it, how are you going to get variation? So it's important, right? No, don't talk about it. You can't talk about it. And so never talk about why? Because we're afraid of getting involved in antitrust litigation.
Correct.
That's what we're
Correct.
afraid of. And our advice from NAR and from attorneys was better safe than sorry. And so maybe we are overdoing it, but let's stay away from any antitrust violations. Well, now here you got people openly talking about circumventing antitrust violations. And it was like, wait, boy, just a year ago, you were deathly afraid to violate it. So now here's what happens. If you take compensation out of the MLS, but you add a concession field, I guarantee you that many agents will use the concession field to talk about compensation. They'll see it as a workaround. And that's not what the DOJ is after. That's not what the plaintiff's attorneys are after. A major MLS that I'm familiar with, they added a compensation field back in May, or a concession field in May. And they were proud to say that like 1,000 agents used it in this short period of time. Well, this MLS has got 100,000 agents, and only 1,000 is a pretty small number in my mind.
Yeah.
And the day that they take and that's okay because they still had they still had the compensation field. But the day they take the compensation field down, if that concession field starts to show 10,000 people using it, 20,000 people, there'll be no doubt in anybody's mind that people are seeing it as a way to get around the new way to do business. So I'm very skeptical. I don't think it makes any sense. Some to add a concession field. Also, if you think about, people are saying, well, we're going to add a field that says concession. Yes, no. Have you seen that one?
I haven't seen that one, but it makes sense.
Oh yeah,
this
is the big.
It's like a flag, concession flag. You raise a flag, you're loading a flag. What is it?
Let's say, well, hey, we're not talking about compensation, but we're going to have a concession field because the seller, and it has to do with one of it's paragraph 5813 talks about it's still okay for the seller to pay concessions. And because it says that, people are saying, hey, if the seller can pay concessions, they can pay closing costs. Well, maybe a buyer broker fee, maybe that's a closing cost. And so maybe it's still okay to do this. And so we're going to put concessions, yes or no. But think about that. That's still a warning. How many, if there were in your MLS, if there were concessions, yes or no, how many people you think will put no? It's not binding. How many people would put no?
Yeah.
Right? Because if you put no, I bet you get fewer people showing your property. So a smart listing agent would always put yes. Why would anybody put no?
By default.
Now, here's another thought. Do you really have to be told whether or not a seller is willing to make a concession in a real? Don't they make concessions?
100%, Saul. Actually, that's one of the points I wanted to ask you about, because my days as an active agent was way before this, but there was never any field in the MLS that would tell me, is the seller willing to budge on price? Forget concessions. Just are they willing to negotiate on something? There's a listing price. That's what they want for the property. If this were Walmart, you'd go, okay, well, this is what this isn't Walmart, right? This is, what's the market? What's the competition? What's the are they, I remember this really clear example from my career as an agent. There was a flipped property. It was an obvious flip. There was an investor involved, right? Had been sitting on the market for a month. And I'm like, I know a thing or two about investing. Every week this property is in the market is costing this investor a lot of money. They're probably on leverage, right? They're leveraging it. They've already lost a couple points this month. So there's some there's some softening there. I went in and asked for a concession. I didn't even ask them if they were willing to do it. I said, this is the price. And we'll sign a deal tomorrow, because I can kind of tell what the situation is, right? And then I talked to the agent, and then it was obvious that was the situation. Okay, great. They never signaled anything to me. They never had to raise a flag. They never did. But I kind of knew the market. I kind of knew the property, and then I tried. And if they would have said no, well, then I would have tried something else. But there's I think I know what you're getting at, saying, does it have to be obvious that they're willing to make some kind of concession, because they've never done that before, other than this compensation concession field. Every other aspect of the transaction is never that clear, where we put a form and it's automatic on the MLS. Because my interpretation of the settlement, my interpretation of the intention behind it, is that everything should be that way, right? They're trying to make every aspect, concessions on inspection, concessions on low appraisal, compensation of the agents. They're trying to put everything in that bucket, right? Because my thinking is, if they put it in that bucket where we don't know what's going to happen, let's figure it out, and let's leave it up to the ability. The market, wins a lot of time with the competitive situation and the talent of the negotiators. Let's just leave it up to that. Like we leave up 90% of everything in the transaction is usually that, right? Is that the intention, Saul? Is that what we should be going towards?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely. So let's look at this thing called concessions, because to me, it's obviously a flagrant violation. Because think about the idea that, first of all, every piece of real estate's unique. Secondly, the value is an opinion. Even an appraisal is an opinion of value. So a list price is just a stake in the ground. Has a seller ever sold a property for less than the listed price? Well, except for in recent years, almost always, right? Matter of fact, they price it knowing, isn't selling it for less than the listed price a concession? Do we really need to be told that the seller is willing to make a concession? We don't need to be told that. That's the way that it works. To all of a sudden, out of nowhere, to pop up 3 months before the extraction of the compensation field from the MLS, to say, hey, we just had a great idea. We looked at all of our past transactions and we found out that concessions were made, because most MLSs do require or make available the ability to put any concessions in. This will help appraisers after the close. Hey, we had so many people enter this in after the close. Yeah, it was a mandatory field. So of course you had people enter in. Oh, yeah, well, there's so many, they actually made concessions, and we think that's so valuable, we're going to put a concession field before it closes. That is, to me, just so transparent and aimed to allow this to go business as usual, that it's almost laughable, unfortunately. Now, there are good people I know, attorneys I know, say, oh, no, this is fine. This is well within the bounds of the settlement. Now, at our MLS, we don't want to put our MLS, our owner, which is our association, our broker subscribers, we don't want to put them at risk. We want to be conservative. We want to take this slowly. We want to see what's happening. Again, in the remarks section, couldn't you say something like, call listing agent for showing instructions? Call listing agent for showing instructions. And then if you've done your job, explain to the seller as the listing agent how valuable somebody representing the buyer is to the transaction. And it's not the seller that pays the commission, it's the transaction that really generates the money to pay the commission. And if sellers understand this, then I think we'll have will have an easier time through this transition period. But initially, I think there will be some issues because people really don't know how to go about it. The other thing is that people are just starting to pay attention. And August,
Oh, yeah.
I think August 16th is when we'll get the most attention from people, right?
Absolutely.
That's just
I
the
think
way
there
it
was
is.
a lot of excitement, around the March timeframe, a lot of concern, a lot of, and then it kind of dipped for, during the spring season, the summer season. And then only a couple of weeks ago, it's become this huge, discussion, but because the deadline is here. The deadline is here. And obviously, there's a lot of misinformation, around that. One of the points I want to ask you, Saul, around these misinformation points is because, I think it's misinformation because I think it's not purposeful. I think people are just confused. And like you said, some parts of the settlement are kind of ambiguous. I've seen this discussion hashed out over the last week or two around whether offers of compensation can be made on your personal website, right? An IDX enabled website, an MLS connected, in a sense, an MLS fed website. Some people are saying that the settlement term saying is that you can't make an offer of compensation on the MLS or any affiliated website. Some people are interpreting that as meaning your own personal IDX website. Some people are saying that that's beyond the scope of the settlement, and you can put whatever you want on your personal website, be that an offer of compensation or concession or anything else, right? Where do you land on that? What have you heard? What's the current discussion? Has that been settled, or is there some ambiguity on where you could put an actual bona fide offer of compensation?
Well, I thought it was settled for, initially when I read the document, it pretty much and then everything that we read after that for a while seemed to indicate that on your own listings, on your own website, you could state the offer of compensation. And I've sought legal advice and have it in writing that, yeah, that seems to be fine. You can put it on your own personal website, but it can only be your listings. Now, remember, the DOJ really doesn't like the idea of brokers paying brokers. And so this would still allow compensation. And a lot of firms think that this whole thing, compensation, broker to broker, is going to go away. So while some people, the settlement doesn't say you can't do this, and it's been interpreted by many, it makes sense to me that on your own listings, you can do this. You do have people saying you can't. And then you have people saying, well, maybe you can, but you might as well change now because it's going to go away at some point in the future. But yes, currently, the best legal advice that I have is if it's your listing on your site, you can, right? Now, some MLSs are saying, and people are saying, why don't we put a link inside the MLS that links people to our website where we've got our listings, and then we'll put our compensation there. And I've received advice that says, well, that's okay. The settlement doesn't preclude that. Just make sure the link doesn't go right to a page on compensation, that it maybe goes to your homepage and that somewhere else inside there. I said, be cautious. Yeah. We're talking about antitrust. And so to answer your question, Gus, yeah, if it's your listing, it seems like you should be able to do that. Now, there are other ways, like I said, pick up the phone and call, because this settlement doesn't outlaw compensation. It doesn't say no Correct. Compensation. It doesn't say Absolutely. That, right? Call, ask. And again, it's up to listing agents to be able to explain the benefits that a good buyer agent can bring and the protection. And it's up to buyer agents to be able to explain themselves. Now, it's going to be harder on the buy side to explain your value. If you got your license yesterday, it's going to be hard to explain your value. I was talking Absolutely. To someone this morning, how can I explain my value? Well, one way I can explain my value is to say, look, I've been a real estate agent for 20 years. I've done 2,000 transactions. My average savings to my buyer from listed price is X number of dollars.
Yeah.
And I am going to charge this much, but I usually get great results. And I'm going to ask the seller to pay me as well. right? But you're going to have to make the case. There's going to have to be
That's the question.
something that, right, that substantiates your, instead of what agents have said for years, I'm worth it. Have you heard this?
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely.
don't cut your commission. You're worth every penny. Well, why? For what reason? Well, you didn't have to explain that because the MLS made sure you got paid
Absolutely.
because the MLS was an offer of compensation.
Or even worse, people said, "Well, you don't have to pay me anyway." It's like it's absolutely that was probably the other, in the spectrum.
That was a
It's free, like, so why not, use me? Because I'm a good guy and we like each other. That was probably the most extreme case. And so I'm seeing a lot. You touched on it a minute ago in your response. There is this overarching concern from some of the big brokerages and a lot of the agents saying that maybe the settlement allows this or doesn't exclude this. But there's this overarching concern. The DOJ is going to come in and change this anyway. People are trying to get ahead of it. Some of the big brokerages are, some of the teams are, some agents are, some coaches are saying, you know what, this might be allowed, it might not. But since the DOJ is going to change it anyway, we should do this. What is your take on the likelihood of that? Are we going to see probably going to see a new consent decree based on the reaction to this settlement? Is it if you were a betting man, Saul, is it 50-50? Are you the over under on us seeing, because some people are now conflating this, right? The DOJ settlement, like that wasn't the DOJ settlement. I tagged you on a comment from an agent saying, "Oh, the Chevron decision changes everything," and I'm like, I don't think the Chevron has anything to do with this because the DOJ didn't mandate this settlement, right? It's actually coming from a civil lawsuit. So what do you do? So not yet, doesn't apply yet. So what do you do there? And you have this combination of people thinking it's the civil settlement, people thinking it's the DOJ. I had an agent, my personal favorite so far, said it was the Supreme Court that mandated, these changes, to the MLSs. What's your thought on this impending? It seems like people are banking on it, Saul. It's a done deal. It's just a question of when and how far these additional restrictions are going to come in. What are your thoughts on that? If you have to put some money on there, if you have to wager $1, something's going to happen.
So I would go 50-50, but I would say it's interesting because the settlement itself might have antitrust issues. So if you go through the settlement and you read it, it might have its own antitrust issues. And so it's really tough. And because there's all this confusion, it's the environment is ripe for the DOJ to come in and say, look, there's just too much confusion and it doesn't go as far as we want. And we could even see the Federal Trade Commission coming in to enforce. There's a lot to this beyond just this civil litigation and civil settlement that won't even be final till November, that the DOJ has openly said, if you read the settlement and you read the statement of interest in the MLS PIN case in New England, where it's obvious the settlement doesn't go far enough to match what the DOJ wants. Now, will they step in? Well, I don't know, but if you read the executive order that was put out by the Biden administration early on and how they want to look at the real estate industry in particular, how they want to look at illegal tying, there's other issues. We just saw the reviving of the Rex case, which was Zillow and the Rex case. We just saw the appeal by NAR pushed aside, and the DOJ now can offer these subpoenas, these CIDs, and so that's a big threat. That you could be looking at criminal prosecution on the part of the DOJ if they don't get what they want in these settlements, if they come in and recommend to the court that the parties change some of the decisions in the settlement agreement. So I'd say that it's right for the DOJ. And if I had to bet, I can't imagine the DOJ going this far and then stopping based on this settlement.
Back.
Because now, the DOJ has been involved with NAR before. They've been involved with litigation. They've been involved with consent decrees. They've been involved, and the bottom line is nothing changed. And so the DOJ really has the industry on the ropes. in part because of the civil litigation and where it's led. And why would they pull back now? Something they've been trying to do for the past 50 years.
Yeah,
And
100%.
so I tend to believe we'll see something from the DOJ that will be more restrictive than the settlement. And again, knowing that the settlement itself isn't perfect and might have, according to some attorneys, some of its own antitrust issues. So we're in for, I've said this my whole life. It seems like, we live in interesting times. There's an old Chinese proverb. You know what? They're always interesting times. You haven't seen any period of time it hadn't been interesting. This one for sure is going to bring about what we refer to as a paradigm shift, which is a major change to the way people do business. The DOJ has attempted to change this, and plaintiffs have attempted to change this over the years and have not been wholly successful in doing so. It looks like we're on the cusp of that now. My advice to agents is, it's been this for years, is define yourself, create your value proposition. Why would you hire you over your competitor? What do you do different? What do you bring to the table? Use these, what I always refer to as the driving forces of consumerism: speed, convenience, choice, value added, quality, service, discounts, and information. That's what consumers want. So how can you integrate that story into your story? Speed, convenience, choice, value added, quality, services, discounts, information. How do you integrate those points into your sales presentation, as you now must convince people to pay you, right? On the buy
Absolutely.
side. Sell
Yeah.
side, you're still there, but on the sell side, it's imperative that you also be able to deliver the message as to the benefits that the buyer agent brings to the transaction. And it's not you, the seller, it looks like that you, the seller, that pays what word should we use? Consideration to both of the brokers. It is the transaction that generates the money that can then be distributed to the parties that work for the principals, both the seller and the buyer, to make this happen. And it's going to take some adjusting, and people are going to have to get used to it. And I do believe that newer agents are going to be at a disadvantage. I can't see how they wouldn't be. I think big brand names become more important. I used to always say it was personal and personal brand, and that's the way I operated when I sold real estate. I had my own brand and my own company, and I didn't affiliate with any franchise and any big company. But in part of your value proposition today might just be some of that big brand affiliation. And now I'm not, and I love, small broker. Most people are not affiliated with the major brand, but just in my mind, as I think through this, I'm thinking that could be a positive for people today.
I think so. Another, hypothesis I've got, because a lot of things, like you said, Saul, we're at the cusp of a paradigm shift. A lot of things can happen. A lot of things are possible. One of those possibilities for me is that people tie themselves to a brand or tie themselves to a team. This team brand, right? Tie yourself to that, because number one, it can allow some of the newer agents to gain instant credibility if that team has a brand, a well-known brand, an established brand. And more important than that, I think some of these teams or some of the really well-run brokerages have really good training. Some, not all, some of them do. How to say, every office is independently owned and operated, right? But some of them do have excellent training, and some of them are adapting really, really well to some of these changes. Some of the big teams out there, Saul, they're salivating at this because they have very well-trained agents that are thinking of just gobbling up market share, because they know how to get these buyer agreements signed. They have a very solid value proposition, and they're going, you want to go with that nobody, or do you want to go with a professional? Because I am that professional, right? They're very confident in their ability Because if they go, if this is a more level playing field among agents, and the more talented ones will win, then we're going to win, right? So I think that might see the emergence of more of these like mega teams, very large cross brokerage, cross MLS, cross state teams that just gain advantages because of this, because the bar has been raised. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. That's one of my hypotheses. We'll see if that actually plays out that way. You can always make the argument that the best trade agent was going to win, but I think when you remove that offer of compensation, it becomes even more true than it was before, because your skills matter, even more. So one last question, Saul, I want to be respectful of your time. You've mentioned a few times how important that listing agent to seller conversation is, because a lot of the issues can be, we just nip it in the bud right there. And that initial conversation, it's not just the agent with the buyer, because that's a really important conversation too, but the listing agent with the seller having that offer of compensation discussion. I've heard it mentioned several times. I just had an interview with a really good real estate coach on Friday, that part of the value proposition they're tying to that offer of compensation is protect them against steering, right? The same concern you've mentioned a few times in this conversation, saying you don't want to get steered. You don't, or I don't know if that's the right word. You don't want to be on the wrong side of a steering conversation from a potential buyer agent. Is that another area of concern? Because I think if we're using that, because as I was talking to this coach, I'm like, I don't know if we should say that. I don't know. I don't know if we should encourage, because we're kind of encouraging that, saying, oh, if I'm a buyer's agent and there's 5 houses similar and 4 are offering compensation and one's not, I might not even make the call to that 5th home. I might not even present an offer requesting compensation from that 5th home. You don't want to be that 5th home, Mr. Seller. Let's not be that 5th home. Let's be competitive in this marketplace, because I know that 90% of homes are offering some form of some kind of offer of compensation. We should be on that boat. Do you have any thoughts? Have you heard a concern around that? Because again, the listing agents are approaching it from I don't think from a bad place. They're just trying to lay out the competitive situation. But there's that steering conversation, saying the agent is kind of saying, we steer all the time. You don't want to be steered. You want to be part of the club. Is there concern there, Saul?
Yeah, you bet. That's exactly what the DOJ is after, the fear of
100%.
steering, right? Because we would all say, we don't steer. We don't steer. If they offer 1% or 2% or 3%, I'll take my client. I have a fiduciary duty to take my client and to the best property that fits them. Maybe there is no steering, but one of the things that keeps the commission, the compensation high, according to the DOJ, is the fear of steering. And if you're going through the script you just went through, Gus, that is creating this fear of steering. And I think
very clear to me. I think it's clear to me.
I think that's the same. That's the same thing as saying everybody charges 6%. So let's just say it. And right. You would never say that. So why would you say you have to offer this? Basically, you're saying commissions are fixed, because if you don't offer it,
you don't play,
your
Paul.
property's not going to get shown.
Yeah, we're going to get blacklisted in a sense.
Yeah, I think that that's a mistake to take that approach. I think you take on liability if you take that approach. And I think a better approach is to explain to a seller that they're going to be asked to pay the commission of the buyer agent, explain how the transaction works, explain the benefits that a buyer agent brings, explain how without the buyer you don't have a deal, explain that the financing and the funding comes in because the buyer qualifies. Make the case for the transaction is where the commission dollars come from. And then do a net sheet and figure out, what you're willing to accept based on paying the compensation, concession, whatever it turns out to be on the buy side. But make that case. It's legitimate. We know that it's the truth. But to say, hey, you got to offer this amount or nobody will show your property, you're playing right into the hands
100%.
of the DOJ. who
It seems
say
like that.
that's exactly what people do, and that's wrong. And that's what's elevated commissions.
I got you. 100%. So yeah, I had that kind of sinking feeling, kind of hearing that, because I'm trying to put myself well, not in the shoes of the DOJ, in the shoes of the seller, saying, okay, well then what choice do I have? Because some sellers, as I'm discussing this with agents, Saul, it's fascinating. I love having conversations with agents that are in the field, that are just giving their honest, not even their opinion. They're stating the fact of what's happened, how this is playing out. And there are some sellers, because of the media coverage of the narrative, that are holding their ground. I'm not going to offer anything. Let's see what the market comes up with. I'm not offering
Well, you know
anything to
what?
anyone, and we'll see what happens. We'll see where the chips fall, and we'll figure it out. I understand your recommendation, Mr. Listing Agent. I'm paying you, right? But let's see what the other side proposes. And they're sitting down and kind of crossing their arms, and they're seeing kind of how this shakes out, which I think is going to be also a valid point. One particular case I really enjoyed, which was an agent that wrote out like a 5-paragraph narration on Lab Coat Agents, fascinating a post, and he said, we played it out. I recommended they pay. They refused, and they said, let's see how things play out. They were willing to concede, but they didn't let anybody know. But they were willing to make a concession. But the seller was adamant. I'm only gonna concede if I don't have any other option to, Mr. Agent.
Yeah.
Let's let it play out. And it was a multiple offer situation. And the listing agent, who was a pretty good writer, narrated the different reactions that agents had because this is before these changes, Saul. So when in that field that said offer of compensation, he put 0, right? Had to come out and say 0, which is very different than not having one. I agree. But the reactions were immediate. They were saying, the reactions went from the spectrum of, how could you do this? Traitor, you're keeping all the commission for yourself. That was one group of reactions, kind of from ignorance, right? And the other set of reactions were some buyer agents that were locked and loaded, ready to go. Like they knew exactly what to do. Oh, you're not offering anything? Yeah, but this is what I want. So I'm submitting the offer. You tell me if we have a deal or not. And that there were 3 agents out of maybe a dozen that didn't even bat an eye. They said, this is how much you want as a concession. They were ready to go. And the listing agent said, Saul, I thought this was the most illuminating part of this story, was that every single one of them was below what the seller would have been willing to give. He said, I knew what the number was, right? I knew what our limit was. No one got close to it. No one went over it. And this is where he added a little bit of a unnecessary comment saying, I wouldn't have worked for that amount of money. I would have asked for more. And maybe I get shot down, maybe it doesn't work, but I would have charged what I like to charge. I'm not going to throw any numbers out there, but he said, this is what I would have. I don't show homes for less than this. And these buyer agents are willing to accept less. In my mind, I said, this is exactly what the plaintiffs wanted. This is exactly what they want, right? It seemed like an ideal scenario. Like the market's there. It was a blind auction. No one knew who was going to offer what. No one knew who was going to concede what. People just went out there and asked. And I thought that spectrum of agents pretty accurately, 3 out of a dozen seems like about the right amount of agents that know what they're doing, well-trained, ready to go, versus people that aren't. What are your thoughts on that story?
Well, so think about this. First of all, if you're going to negotiate something, why would you say, I'll sell it for this? By the way, I'm willing to take less. Right? That's like, it doesn't make sense to give away.
No other scenario.
Why would you give away but that's why this concession, yes or no, makes no sense to me. Why would you say, here's what I want, but by the way, I'll take less? That doesn't give you any advantage in negotiating. So that's the first point. Another point is kind of interesting. Know that this is kind of odd at this time because it's been a seller's market. And so I've been saying this for a couple of years. In a seller's market, and this is part of the DOJ's, I think, case or evidence, in a seller's market, you don't need a buyer's agent to bring the buyer. See, isn't one of the things that buyer's agent does is bring the buyer? They bring the buyer. So part of the value is that the buyer's agent brings the buyer to the transaction. But in a market where you're going to get 20 offers, all of them 10% or more over the list price, and the buyers are going to waive inspections, Why should any seller say ahead of time, hey, all I got to do is put a sign in the ground and I'm going to have all kinds of people bringing me offers? Why do we need to offer what you say is, hey, nobody's going to show it? I don't care. I'm going to have so much traffic when we run an ad or we put it on one of these portals, or you just put it, we're going to get, it's a seller's market. And so if I were a seller, I would, in a red hot market, and I know it's cooled down now, but in a red hot market, I wouldn't offer what people would consider a full commission. Why? I would offer something other than that, knowing we're going to get a lot of offers on the property. And so now there's not as much value in that part of what a buyer's agent does, which is bring a buyer to the transaction. At the same time, in a slow market, in a buyer's market, you might pay more. I remember charging 7% commission, keeping 3 and paying 4 to the buyer's agent.
Yep. I remember that
Right?
market too.
Right. And I
Also known as a
remember
buyer's
trips to
market.
Hawaii, right? And all kinds of other premiums to the person that brings me an offer. And you bring me an offer on this property, we buy this, we end up selling this property to your buyer. I'm going to give you more.
Yeah, absolutely.
I listed many, I'm going to tell you how long ago. I was first licensed in 1975. I listed a 4-unit for 4%. I kept 1 and gave 3% to the buyers, the person who brought the buyer to the transaction.
Wow.
It depends on the market.
Absolutely.
And what you're willing to do. And this idea that I'll only work for so much, I'm worth so much, that needs to change, because I wouldn't show properties for less than that amount. Yeah, unless you need to buy dinner on Friday night, and then you will, maybe, right? So there's so many circumstances. And I go back to, it's the transaction. It's the real estate purchases are not necessarily a zero-sum game. And that's important for people to realize. Zero-sum game where you have winners and losers. You don't have to have winners and losers. That, as a matter of fact, a well-performed real estate transaction, because every piece of real estate is unique, the buyer is satisfied and the seller is satisfied and the agents are satisfied. And believe it or not, you can have, that's why people say to me, oh, you got to have your own advocate. Oh, everybody's got to have, you can't have dual aid because you got to have your own advocate. Well, maybe an advocate is not what you need. Maybe you need someone that puts together, someone who can find that common ground wherever. It's not always I win at your expense.
Correct.
I need an advocate, so I win at your expense. That's not necessarily the case in a residential real estate transaction.
I agree with you, Saul. And Saul, as parting words, what recommendations do you give people, that are out there? In the next couple of weeks, we'll see a lot of anxiety and nervousness, and all that. What would you leave some of these agents that are watching this with? What's your recommendations? Other than read paragraph 58, what other concrete things would you tell them to do over the next couple of weeks to prepare for this? What do you think?
I'd say generate your value proposition. Be able to explain your value proposition. Talk to listing agents. Explain your value proposition. Have them give you feedback as to, is that convincing? Is that a good enough story for me to take to my seller? But work on that value proposition. Make it as tangible as you can. Bring all your benefits to the table and get ready for a new way to do business.
Absolutely. Saul, it's going to be a brave new world. We'll be figuring things out. We'll be learning so much over the next few months. We'll take things off of the, hypothetical train and down in the rubber meets the road train. So I can't wait for that. And I can't wait for our next conversation, hopefully in a few months, where we'll be titling it, the learnings from the first few months of the NAR settlement. Saul, as always, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Folks, this has been another action-packed episode. So many good nuggets here. Saul, thank you so much. Appreciate you. And I'll see you folks on the next one.
Good to be here, Gus. Thanks.